Psalm 83. Years ago, I determined to go bow hunting. I'm not a hunter, and it was always more likely that I would be able to hunt with a rifle than with a bow and arrow, but there you have it. I was determined that I would go bow hunting. I failed to mention what I was planning on hunting. I was going to hunt for bear. But you're not a hunter, you say. That's true, but why let little things like that stand in the way of complete insanity? I borrowed a bow, I bought some arrows, and bought a target. Spent hours shooting at that target with little improvement. I think if there had been a bear in the Pennsylvania woods, quaking in fear because of my bow hunting plans, think if I actually saw one and it stood completely still and didn't move and maybe turned and exposed its chest to me and kind of waved and said, "Shoot, man, shoot," I might have been able to graze it. Maybe. But then I probably would have just made it really mad. And such it is with people who desire to take their fight against God. They have a weak little bow. He's a bear. This is the culture we live in right now. I rather doubt people who claim to be atheists actually believe there's no God. Most of them just hate the God that is. They hate our God. Revelation says that when God wreaks his vengeance on the earth, they will shake their fists at the heavens and they will curse him. Let me prove to you that this is the world in which we live. Just one little proof. Even the most genteel people today say, "Oh my God," when something happens to them. Some Christians even do this. Jesus is their swear word. Have you ever noticed they don't swear by other gods? I've never heard somebody say, "Oh my Zeus." Depending on what city you're in the United States, it could be dangerous to say, "Oh my Allah." In fact, I've yet to hear a curse word with gods such as Odin and Thor and Apollo and Hercules, even though there are people who claim to follow these gods. I've never heard anybody swear by Ganesh or Shiva or Krishna, but I have heard Hindus say, "Oh my God." I guess it's okay to swear a curse using our gods' names. Then, of course, there's how Jesus is treated in the media. Here's another proof. There are websites dedicated to Jesus jokes. Most of our most popular comedians have mocked Jesus in their acts. And then what about divine retribution? If you really want to get people angry, just talk about hell. Because if they believe that hell exists, they'll say it's not fair, it's not equitable, and they'll even call God a monster for creating it. Remember, Jesus said, "The world hates me." Don't get confused by that. It wasn't just his world that hated him. The world has always hated Jesus. Even before Jesus was God incarnate on earth, they've always hated God, so they aim their bows at him. But remember, he's a bear. What happens when people lash out at God? They usually end up aiming at God and hitting believers in the process. God's people are hated too. Jesus said, "Don't be surprised that the world hates you." They're aiming at him, but they hit you. And this is what we find in Psalm 83. It really is a song of triumph, of God's victory over evil. Consider with me that those who assault God's people are aiming at God. It can seem that the world is against us. Look at verse 6. Here we have the psalmist listing out the names of the people who were against Israel. The tabernacles of Edom, the Ishmaelites, of Moab, and the Hagarenes, Gebal, Ammon, Amalek, the Philistines with the inhabitants of Tyre. Assyria is joined with them, and they have helped the children of Lot. Israel faced a confederation of enemies committed to stamping it out. The confederacy included some of Israel's closest neighbors. Edom is the offspring of Ishmael, a son of Abraham. Moab and Ammon That's Gebal. And Ammon are the offspring from Lot. Amalek was one of Israel's oldest enemies. And they are almost animalistic in their enmity and anger against Israel. In verse 2, they are described as growling like a bear or like a wolf. In verse 4, they are bloodthirsty in their desire for Israel's death. And behind it all, the great superpower of the day, Assyria, is supporting the Moabites and the Ammonites, the children of Lot. And so their attacks are seemingly against God's people, but notice, they really are against God himself. Did you see all the way God is referred to in the first 5 verses? Don't keep silent, O God. Hold not your peace. Don't be still. Your enemies make a tumult. They hate you, verse 2. They took crafty counsel against your people and consulted against your hidden ones. Verse 5, they have consulted together with one confederate against you. What is the psalmist saying? It seems like they're angry at Israel, but actually they're angry at God. And ladies and gentlemen, this is still true today. It seems like the world hates you, but they really hate your God. They really hate the one you worship. It's funny, by the way, did you notice verse 4? They said, "Come, let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel be no more in remembrance." How many years ago was this written? Was this written 2 weeks ago? Boy, doesn't that sound contemporary. They're united in their public pledge to destroy the people of God. But their real target is him. They are God's enemies, verse 2. They hate him, verse 2. Their confederacy is against him, verse 5. Stop for a moment and recognize what the psalmist is saying here. What is Asaph saying? He's actually saying that while the forces of evil are turned against you, God's people, the reality is their hatred, their anger, their desire to destroy is directed at your Lord. This is why Paul writes in Ephesians 5, "Have no union, no companionship with the unfruitful works of darkness." How can we be confederate, to use that term, with those who are themselves confederate against our God? How can we in any way join up, enlist, participate, be a pal to, be a friend to the very things that hate our God? Why would we find their words entertaining? Why would we find their hatred to be something we would want to involve ourselves into? Why would we want to do that? Have nothing to do with them, Paul says. Our testimony should be a source of shame to others in our community who hate God. Our convictions should prevent us from living in sin like they live in sin around us. And our love for Jesus should be so evident, so apparent to the world around us, that they will hate us just like they hate him. In fact, I really like what John Wesley, I think it was, got off his horse one day, got down on his knees and said, "Lord, it's been a long time since somebody persecuted me because of you." And while he was praying, one of his enemies rode by, saw him, got off his horse, took a rock and chucked it at him. To which then Wesley, the rock whizzing by his head, said, "Thank you, Lord." Answered a prayer. Why is it that we want to be friends with the people who hate our God? Why is it we want to participate with them in all their deeds? As long as it's not directed against God, then it's okay. I'm not saying that you have to separate from every aspect of our culture. I'm not saying that. I don't want us to become Amish in the way we approach life. I'm not saying that, but I am saying that it shouldn't be that God's people should be so close to the world that when God turns his wrath against them, we get singed by its fire. We should be apart. In fact, this is why Paul then says in Ephesians 6, one chapter later. So put on the whole armor of God. And of course, he's not even speaking to individuals. He's speaking to the church. He's saying to the church, put on the armor of God, so that you as a church may be able to stand against the wiles, the trickeries of the devil, our adversary. They're aiming at God. But isn't that their mistake? Because they do often hit God's people. But this brings us to point 2. God's enemies have made a grave miscalculation attacking God's people. In fact, history is littered with the graves of those who made such an attempt. You see it in verse 9. Here's the prayer. Do unto them as unto the Midianites, to Sisera, to Jabin at the brook of Kison, who perished at Endor. They became as dung for the earth. Make their nobles like Oreb and Zeb, the princes as Zebah and Zalmunna, who said, let us take to ourselves the houses of God in possession. Well, the Midianites were destroyed by Gideon in Judges 7 and 8. 4 of their leaders are mentioned here. Oreb and Zeb were captured by the Ephraimites when they took the Jordan around Beth Barah. That's in Judges 7, verses 24 and 25. You remember the story, Gideon. God calls him to go and amass an army and attack the Midianites. And the Midianites have a huge army. And then Gideon goes and he gathers the people together, and God says it's too many people. And of course, when you're gathering an army, I don't know about you, but generally the rule is you can never have enough help. So we have to cut our army down. So he cuts and cuts and cuts to the point where he only has around 300 men. And then, of course, he goes and attacks. And then the Ephraimites, when Gideon wins the battle, say, why didn't you call us out? We would have loved to have joined you. When really they didn't want to join him at all until they found out he was going to win and get all this stuff. And so they say, we want to join in. And so then they go. And they actually are the ones who capture Oreb and Zeb. And we find here that Oreb was executed at the rock of Oreb, if you read the story back in Judges. Zeb was put to death at the winepress of Zeb. I don't think Oreb actually owned the rock. I think it was named for him after he died there. I don't think Zereb had anything really to do with that winepress. It was named for him after he died there. And then the kings of Midian were captured, Zebah and Zalmunna. They were captured by Gideon in Judges 8 in verse 12, and then Gideon kills them in verse 21. In fact, that's kind of an interesting story because Gideon, he has these princes, these kings, these rulers of what is really just a city-state. It's not a nation like we have today. It's more like a city-state, and where you have a city would have an army, and it's not really related to any other city around it. And these kings of the Midianites are there, and they have their army. Well, they've been captured, and Gideon's there, and he says to his boy, his son, kill them. And his son is scared to death, and he doesn't draw his sword, so Gideon kills them. The psalmist uses this example of how a small force of God's people overcomes a much larger force of the world. Gideon led a very small army, but he conquered the entire army of Midian. Full stop here. Understand this. The only thing God really is concerned about in this world is you and me. You understand that? He's in control over the whole earth. He does raise up kings to positions of leadership. He puts down other kings. He is a sovereign ruler over the earth, but he's really not paying very close attention to them. The people he's really thinking about are you and me. What we do is what matters in this world. I know that may seem strange to you. It may seem foreign to you. But ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to tell you, whether America rises and falls will have nothing to do with whether or not a particular person is elected president next year, whether the Supreme Court is conservative or liberal, or whether the houses of Congress are conservative or liberal, whether the state houses are this or that. It doesn't matter. What really matters is whether God's people live God's way in this world. That's all God is really concerned about. So much so that at one point in the Old Testament, when Ahab, I think it's Ahab, it's one of the Old Testament kings who's no good, over the northern kingdom, is actually trying to consult with a prophet. The prophet says, actually, from God, we're not paying attention to you. And if it wasn't for this other king who loves God, I wouldn't even be here. So how you live in the community matters most. It doesn't matter what Mayor Weinbrecht does. Seems like a nice man. I always see him on July 4th when he gets up at Coca Booth and talks about, by the way, Coca Booth died, I think, this past week. I read that in the news. Something. He was a former mayor of Cary. It doesn't matter what the mayor does. It doesn't matter what the town council does. It doesn't matter about all of those things. They don't really matter. What really matters is this. Are you living as God wants you to live in your culture, in your community? That's what God cares about. Jabin was routed by the armies of Israel. He's described as being a king of Canaan in Judges 4. Do you remember the commander of his army? It was Sisera. This is one of my favorite Old Testament stories. It should be for you as well, because Sisera, he's hungry, he's tired. He wanders into the tent of this lady, a sweet, mousy, genteel, kind, loving woman who is just laid back and fearful would be how I describe her, right? Is that how the Bible? Here Sisera comes in. She says, oh, you want something to drink? Let me give you some milk. Hey, let me break some melatonin in the tablets and put it in your milk. Go to sleep. Where's that tent peg? Hey, I know. Let's get some lawn darts and play lawn darts over here. They're kind of like tent pegs. Anyway, some of you don't remember lawn darts. Okay. Mental note, don't use illustrations people have forgotten about. Tent peg. She takes the tent peg and she goes up to the guy. He's laying on his side and, lines it up right over his temple and whack in a tent peg, and he's gone. And then everybody can laugh because Sisera was killed by a woman, Judges 4 and verse 9. You see, God can destroy whomever he wishes. You see, in verse 13, here comes the imprecatory prayer of this psalm. It's one that doesn't sound like Christians, does it? It doesn't feel like Christians are supposed to feel. Okay, God, make them like a tumbleweed, as stubble that just blows by the wind. As the fire sets the woods aflame and the mountains are on fire, so persecute them with your storm, with your tempest, and make them afraid, and fill their faces with shame, so that they may know you did it. That's really what that last sentence is. It's not so that they'll get saved. I don't think that's what he's saying here at all. He's just saying so they'll know you did it. That all these powerful armies are compared to tumbleweeds in comparison to God. They roll, driven by the powerful wind of God's anger and God's wrath. And in this case, the wind is a result of a brush fire. We know how dangerous those can be. We see them every year out west. They consume houses and neighborhoods and communities. It's incredible. The firemen fight against those fires, but often have to retreat because they're so powerful and terrifying. God's power is like that brush fire. It fills the hearts of the arrogant with real fear. And in this case, they are shamed by God's power. And they will know that Israel's rescue was not by their own hand, but by the powerful hand of God. And the world powers of that day, when this psalm was written, were not tumbleweeds because of their lack of technology. Listen, we have in our minds as Christians that these nations that are so great, even ours, that is the greatest superpower in the world, we're the richest country on earth, we have the strongest and largest military on earth, we seem to be invincible, we're a tumbleweed before the Lord. He could blow us away if he wanted to. Poof. Blow us away. If he chose to do it. In fact, people who study eschatology note there's no America seemingly in the end times at all. People have tried to look at verses and say, maybe that's America, maybe this is America. There doesn't seem to be a reference to the United States at all. So you realize God can simply, of the most powerful nations on earth, blow them away because nobody can stand up against him. The doctrine of hell stands strong. Listen, I know that for most of your Christian life, you've been in churches and you've heard people preach the doctrine of hell, and usually it's preached in a way that says, go out and witness to your unsaved neighbors. We think of the doctrine of hell, we think about it as a motive. We don't want anyone to go there. We want to tell them about Jesus, and certainly all of that is true. But listen to me. The way the doctrine of hell is taught by Paul in the New Testament is it is a blessing for believers who are suffering at the hands of the world. That was our reading this morning from 2 Thessalonians chapter 1. What did it say about hell? In flaming fire, taking vengeance on them that know not God. God's fire is one of vengeance, one of his anger against people who reject Jesus Christ. So yes, it's true. I don't want my neighbors to go to hell. That's true. And in my community, I would love to see people come to Christ. That's true. But the doctrine of hell isn't really the doctrine that compels me toward that. That doctrine is the glory of God. As John Piper once said, missions exist because worship doesn't. My neighbors were out playing around this morning in front of their house. I'd really love to have them in church. I'd love to see them taking the first day of our week and just turning that over to the Lord. That would be wonderful. I would love that. And what motivates me for that is to see them worshiping God. I don't want them to go to hell, but I would love to see them worshiping God with me. That's what motivates me for that. But when people are suffering at the hands of governments, especially Christian people are being crushed by the hands of other people, when they are being tortured and their lives are being forfeit, when you see your children hurt, when you see your spouse injured or imprisoned, as has happened throughout church history, we in the United States are living through a very short time of reprieve from that. In fact, our country was founded partially for this reason, and it was a good part of the reason this nation was founded, was to save God's people from that kind of thing. But you understand, ladies and gentlemen, what God is saying here in the Psalms and then later in the New Testament is hell is God's wrath against evil. And if you've ever heard the expression, if there's a God in heaven, they'll get theirs, that's what hell is. And so the psalmist says, okay, Lord, bring all the powers that be that you have against them. People who reject Jesus will die and go to hell and await final judgment. And they'll be judged for their works and cast into a lake of fire where they will spend eternity. And this is what Scripture teaches. And mankind is powerless to prevent it. So because God is all-powerful, attacking him is a huge mistake. These who have tried in generations past are now remembering and realizing why it is so foolish to do that. Our lives are short and fleeting. Pretty important actor. We're the same age, drowned yesterday. It's all over the news. Life's fleeting. Life's short. All these things that we try to do to somehow will our own way against God's will always fall short. But God stands. And because he's all-powerful, attacking him, big miscalculation. Because God, this is point number 3, will be vindicated as the ruler of the world. His enemies will be vanquished. Look at verse 17. Let them be confounded and troubled forever and put to shame and perish. The victory of God over the world shames the world that was against him. All those people who have mocked him, who have passed from this life, are in hell waiting final judgment. They're not mocking him now, I can tell you that. They're waiting final judgment. Those who are mocking him now will soon join their confederates in hell, awaiting final judgment. And when final judgment comes, God will shame them. They'll be raised up, the small and the great, and stand before a great white throne. And the one that they mocked and joked about and poked fun at, and whose name was a byword in their mouths, will sit on that throne and will judge them. And then they, the small and great, the powerful, the rich, the poor, who turned away from Jesus, will be cast by him into a lake of fire. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the final death. That is the second death. And they will lose their minds in terror. He will put them to shame, a different term for shame. So confounded means shame. Shame means shame, just different as the same idea. They'll ultimately be ruined. And there will be global acknowledgement of God's greatness. Do you see verse 18? Now we have worship around the globe. The people of the earth will observe these actions, that they are alone of God, who's most high over the earth. Do you know why the writer of this psalm picked the stories of Gideon and Sisera being killed by the woman? Do you know why he picked those stories? Because it was at a time when Israel was under assault, when it had almost nothing, and yet overcame these huge armies, these huge enemies, and still won the victory. It was so that at that time, everybody could know. Israel would know. Everybody knew. God knew. So he's saying here, look, this is going to happen, and the world will know you did it. It won't be because of anybody else. They'll have to ascribe all of this to Jehovah, and that's Israel's God. And by the way, that's Jesus. The people of the earth will bow, and their tongues confess He's Lord over all the earth. And He will be exalted as El Elyon. His name is Most High. He's the King of all kings. That's what Elyon means. He's the King over all kings. There's never a king on this earth like Jesus. And He's the ruler over all of His creation. Nobody will rule this world like He will. We stand here, ladies and gentlemen, at a precipice. The world is falling off a cliff. I don't know if you recognize this. Our culture is dying. Our culture is dying. We actually are in a death culture. Teenagers know this. Teenagers, are recognizing this. The ones who recognize it are either starting to turn away from media. That's actually beginning to happen. I read this week that a poll released this week is that the youngest generation doesn't like to see pornography or anything like that in movies anymore. I don't want that. They see what's going on. They're rejecting it. Some of them, because of sin and twisting of sin, are actually rejecting who God created them to be. They see it. They don't understand it. They're not responding right, but they can't figure this out. And then, of course, there are the unfortunate times when teenagers take their own lives. It's a culture of death. Our culture, our entire nation is just sliding off of a precipice. The world seems to be sliding off the same precipice. Turkey, the president of Turkey yesterday said that he wants to get involved in the war in Israel. If Turkey gets involved, Iran will get involved. There'll be no question that the United States, we already have advisors. This is what happens. Advisors. Do you know what advisors are when they send them? That means guns and ammo. These are usually special forces. We just sent the SEALs. You don't know about it. They called them advisors, but I guarantee you there are Navy SEALs. There's a Delta Force, Army Delta Force already in the Middle East. There's a general who's got a load full of medals on his chest, Purple Hearts and all sorts of stuff over there. Special Forces general telling people what to do. A Marine general this past week stood up in front of a whole bunch of people down in Fayetteville and told the world, if you attack our people, others will raise your children. That's saber rattling. This is the world sliding up a precipice. And how do we respond to that? God is in control of it all. And He's bringing all of this to some sort of conclusion. And whether it's today, tomorrow, a year from now, 30 years from now, 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, we don't know. He doesn't say, He says, no man knows the time or the season. You can't sit and say wars and rumors of wars. It's not even referencing the rapture anyway. You can't say that. It has nothing to do with this. All of this, you look at it and say, I don't know when it's going to happen, but I do know there's coming a time when the prince of darkness, Satan, and all the people who represent him, they will get theirs. And God will be exalted in glory. And what do we do in the meantime? We just rest and trust. We rest and trust in what God has given to us. I know that God is love, but I also know He's just. And even as God's people are hurt by the assault of godless people against us, His justice will prevail. They will lose. He will win. Friends, they have a little bow, and He's a giant bear. So don't fear what man can do unto you. Yeah, they can harm the body, but they can't touch your soul. Don't be angry at God for what other people do to you when they're venting their hatred against Him. Don't blame God for the ridicule you'll face. Don't turn your anger against God. Turn it against Satan. Don't be embarrassed because you're standing on God's side. He's going to win the battle. Stop being afraid to stand up for the fact that God created the earth. Don't let people say things around you that question that. I've told you this probably more than once. I was sitting in an orthodontist chair. Teenager walks in, sits down in the chair next to me. Lady says, working on her mouth, says, "What'd you learn in school today?" "Oh, we learned about evolution." She's talking about that. I'm just kind of chuckling to myself. It's kind of a sad, sorrowful chuckle, but lady working on my mouth. "What do you think about that?" She saw that I was kind of bemused by it all. "Oh, I think the earth is on the back of a giant turtle. That's what I think. I mean, if we're just going to live in fantasy world." Do you realize if you go to our nation's colleges, some of you went to them, some of you are graduates of these schools, and you go to their science department, they will tell you that you came from a monkey. I'm not making that up. You came from a monkey. And that monkey, well, it came from something else. And you go all the way back, and you go to our nation's Natural History Museum, and you walk inside, and you'll find a video of a little creature that crawled out of some sort of water named Maury. They named this fake creature Maury. It's not the Natural History Museum. It's the National History of Made-Up Things. That's what it ought to be called. And this little creature crawled out. And I'm sitting there, and my wife is sitting next to me because I understand this. She doesn't want me to make a scene, but I really wanted to make a scene. You have got to be kidding me! Have y'all ever read The Emperor's New Clothes? It took the little boy to finally say, the emperor's not wearing anything. Stand up for God. When they curse your God's name, stand up for that. My son and I were talking about this recently. He said, "Dad, it just makes me so mad when the Marines take God's name in vain around me." I tell him, don't do that. Of course, he's in charge most of the time, so don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do it around me. Stand up for Jesus. Be public with your faith. God's going to win. We're on the winning team. The scoreboard might seem devil 100, God 0, but it's really not that way. He's at the foul line, and they're 100-point shots. We're going to win. Big. Why be afraid? Stand up for your faith, but be Christ-like in your arguments. You don't have to yell and scream like they yell and scream. Oh, did you see the video of the pro-Israel rally participant talking to the pro-Palestinian professor from some big school in New England? I think it was New England. It might have been Berkeley. It's about the same. And he said, "Aren't you against terrorism?" It's a yes or no answer. She said, "Oh, it's not yes or no." It's not. But I'm thinking if people can stand out there and in some cases make complete abject fools of themselves for something as little as political issues, why is it we Christians can't stand up in the public square and say, we believe in God? Let me tell you about Jesus. But we can do it in a way that wins people over, in a winsome, sweet, kind way. We don't have to yell when we finally get to speak. Okay, is it my turn? Let me tell you about Jesus. We can do that. One of my professors in college, he was standing at one of these rallies. Not a political rally. It was kind of an anti-God kind of rally. I don't remember exactly what it was about, but it was protesting Christianity. He got his church together, got some water, went down there and just passed water out to folks. Let me talk to you about Jesus. There's a way of doing that. Marilyn Manson came to our town. I remember Christians were out there, churches were out there, passing out water to all the people waiting in the hot sun to hear Marilyn Manson sing. Well, You can be Christ-like in your arguments, and you can turn people toward Jesus. Let me tell you about the one who's going to win the day. Let me tell you about the one who's winning right now. You can win their hearts to him. The world hates your God. Sometimes, in their hatred of God, they aim at him and hit you, and it hurts when they do. But that's a grave miscalculation on their part, because God is greater than anything the world has to offer, and judgment is coming upon them. So, in the interim, let us rejoice in knowing that the day will come where Jesus will be exalted on the earth. When the kings of the earth, as Isaiah says, will put their hands across their mouths and wonder, why did nobody worship this Messiah? Why did nobody worship him? Why did they crucify him? He's the king of the earth. And these will be Gentile kings. And the people of the world will exalt him and praise him. And we'll be there too, ladies and gentlemen, standing beside them. It may be 1,000 years from now, we'll be in glorified bodies, praising the one who redeemed us by his own blood. So live for him and stand for him. They have a little tiny bow. Bing! And he's a giant bear. Let's pray. Father, it's hard to face ridicule, to face trials, to face trouble. It's hard, and to respond like Christ. But when he was reviled, he reviled not again. When he suffered, he threatened not. So, help us to respond like he did. Lord, help us to react to those around us who want to hurt us, to those who would shut the doors of this church, but not to be like them and respond with anger, just to put it in your hands. They're just a tumbleweed before you. The fire of your storm could destroy them. We ask you,